Hi, this is Rethik, sir, your biology SME. Welcome to the MEMONEET all. Yes. So in the last video, we actually had a discussion on the pollen grains, its structure and advantages of pollen grains and in what way the pollen grains they causes allergies and inflammation in the human beings. So and some of the questions which are related to pollen grains. So next to that, we will be discussing about the pollination. So we know that the pollen grains are actually what? Male gametes, right? So there has to be a transfer of this pollen grains from the basically what happens when I'm talking about the pollination, it is a mechanism which has actually been achieved by some objectives. So what is the objectives here? So here it is actually a transfer of the pollen grains, that is shedding of the pollen grains, right? Shedding of the pollen grains from where? So they're actually being from anther. So shedding of the pollen grains from the anther, then that been transferred to the stigma of the pistil. So it is actually called as pollination, and this entire mechanism is actually called as pollination. So pollination, there are different ways or different kinds of pollinations are there. So in which one of the pollination, so three kinds of pollinations have been discussed. So one is autogame and gytenogame and xenogame. So one by one, let us discuss the different types of pollination. Yes. So, as I told, the very first pollination is autogamy, right? So, I'm talking about the autogamy. The pollination is actually achieved within the same flower. Same flower in sense, if you are seeing this specific flower here, you'll get an idea. So what is happening? The pollination, whatever the pollen grains from the anther has been transferring into the stigma of the same flower. So that means here the pollination has been achieved within the same flower is actually called as autogamous. So when I'm talking about the autogamy, how the pollination happens here? So there should be a synchronized pattern between both shedding of the pollen grains as well as maturity of the stigma. See, for example, when I'm talking about the autogamy, so in an autogamy kind of pollination, so a synchronized pattern is required. So that is, the pollen is being released, and on the same time, the stigma should also have that receptivity. That means the stigma should also be matured and it should also show the receptivity. Then only this autogamy phenomena happens. So anther and stigma, another very important thing is this anther as well as the stigma, they should lie close to each other. That means they should be very close to each other in such a way that self-pollination can occur. If they are not close to each other, what happens? The self-pollination will not happen. Then the third one is some examples have also been given where in plants such as viola and oxalis, and some of them are they commonly produce two types of flowers. So one is chasmogamous flowers and the another one is clusterogamous flower. So in the plasmogamous and clusterogamous flower, you will again see a kind of in the autogamy itself, you will again see two kinds of flowers which have been produced in the autogamy. So as I told, in the plasmogamous flower, what happens? Yes, in the plasmogamous flower, what happens is you will see a kind of flowers which are similar to the flower of the other species with exposed anther, okay, and the stigma. So you can actually see here, it is an exposed anther as well as the stigma will also be exposed. And when I'm talking about the clusterogamous flower, so they're actually closed type. So can you see here what happens? The flower is entirely closed. So that anther and, stigma as well as the anther, so they're not exposed. So fertilization in this way, what happens is, will be obviously will not happen. That is cross-pollination will not happen. So here in the plasmogamous, sometimes at some rare condition, what happens? The cross-pollination might occur, but in the clusterogamy, at any condition, the cross-pollination will never occur. That is, there is no chance of the cross-pollination itself. This is clear with you all? Yes. The next we have is gytenogamy. So in the gytenogamy, what happens? There is a transfer of the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. But here you need to understand is of the another flower of the same plant. So there is the same plant, but here what happens? There is a cross-pollination is happening between the two different flowers of the same plant. That is another flower of the same plant. So here it normally involves a pollinating agents are required, like it could be wind pollination or it could be some insects and all. And genetically it is similar to the autogamy, because what happens is here the pollination is happening within the same species, that is the same plant. But here what is happening is the flowers are different now. Okay, so that is not happening within the same flower, but it is happening in two different flowers but within the same plant. So genetically they might be similar, that is the pollen grains that comes from the same plant. So that's why genetically they might be similar. But when I'm talking about pollination is not happening within the flower, but it is happening between the two flowers in the same plant. Okay, you need to understand when I'm talking about autogamy, here what is happening is in the same plant, the pollination is happening within the same flower. In the same flower only, you have the stigma, and you have the anther as well as you have the stigma. So pollination is happening within the same flower. Whereas in the gytonogamy, the pollination is happening within the same plant, but in two different flower. Clear to you? So the last one is xenogamy. So in xenogamy, what we can see is there is a transfer of the pollen grains from anther to the stigma, but of different plants here. Okay, so they are happening in different plants. So this is actually going to bring the genetically different types of pollen grains to the stigma, because here what is happening is the pollen grains has been transferring from one plant of the flower to the another plant. Okay, from one plant of the anther, from one flower of the anther of one plant to the another plant of the stigma. So that is called as xenogamy. And again in xenogamy also you require the pollinating agents. So what are these pollinating agents that I'm talking about? So why this pollinating agents plays a very important role in the pollination and how? Let us discuss now. So as I told you, the agents of pollination, we have actually two agents of pollination. One is biotic and abiotic. See, in abiotic, it is non-living, that is through the wind and water. When I'm talking about the biotic, so it is through the animals. So in abiotic pollination, one is wind and water. First, let us know how the wind is going to help in the pollination. Pollen grains, basically, when I'm talking about the wind pollination, it's the most common mode of pollination among in the abiotic mode of pollination. Okay, so wind pollination also requires that the pollen grains, like in when coming to the wind pollination, so pollen grains requires, that means what are the futures, in what way the pollen grain should be. So pollen grains, that basically in wind pollination, whatever the pollen grains that normally pollinate through the with the help of wind, they are light and non-sticky. This is one point. And the second thing is they often possess well-exposed stamens. Okay, so they normally possess well-exposed stamens, and large often it should also have a feathery stigma, so that it could easily trap the airborne pollen grains. That is the pollen grains which normally comes from air. So feathery stigma, so that when the pollen grains comes, they can easily trap those pollen grains. And often they should have a single ovule in each ovary and numerous flowers which are packed into it. So that is inflorescence. Okay. And one example is a familiar example is the corn cob. So when you see a corn cob here, so there the tassels that we normally see are nothing but the stigma as well as the stale, which wave in the wind to trap the pollen grains. So another one thing is the wind pollination is most common in the grasses also. The next we have is water pollination. So in water pollination, it is most regular mode of transport for both male gametes among the lower plants such as algae, bryophytes, and pteridophytes. So some bryophytes and pteridophytes, that their distribution is limited because basically you remember when I was talking about the plant kingdom. So what is a mode of reproduction? They actually require water for their mode of reproduction, right? So that's why they're limited. They're being limitedly distributed because they need water here for the transport of the male gametes, and for fertilization it normally needs water. So that's why their distribution is limited. Some examples of water pollinations are Vallisneria as well as Hydrilla, which grows in actually a fresh water, and several margin like sea grasses such as Zostera. So that these are the example for the water pollinated plants. And not all aquatic plants, they use water for the pollination. In major of the aquatic plants, like if you see the water, lily and all. So there what happens is the flower emerges above the level of the water. That is, if this is a water, okay. So what happens is the flower normally emerges above the water. As a result, the pollination normally occur by the help of wind or insects. So pollination is actually with the help of insects or wind. So in some water plants like water lily and all, you don't see pollination happens within the water, or they need water for transfer of this gametes from one from anther to the stigma. No, instead insects and wind acts as a pollinating agent here. So that is again very important thing. So next going to the next. So what about in the water pollination? How the pollination normally occurs in water then? So you have heard about this example, like right now I have discussed one as Vallisneria. Yeah. So in Vallisneria, what happens? Basically, when I'm talking about the water pollination here, uh, you can see here that is in this figure, what happens is the female, basically the female, the flower, it normally reach out on the surface of the water. Okay. So as you can see here, the female flowers, it normally reaches to the surface of the water by the long stalk. And the male flower, it also reaches to the surface of the water, as you can see. And later on, what happens? It is going to release its pollen grain. Okay. So now it is going to release many pollen grains. And the pollen grains have been carried out to the water current and it reaches to the female flower. That means ultimately what happens? They have been carried passively by the water current, and eventually what happens? The stigma of the female flowers and the stigma of the female flower, it catches those pollen grains and fertilization happens. So this is one way in which the Vallisneria you can see the kind of pollination. Again, in some like okay, so this was all about the Vallisneria. What? No, both will actually come on to the surface of the water, basically. That means the female flower also, it also comes, it reaches to the surface of the water, and the male gametes, it is being released on the surface of the water. So now the male gametes, that is the pollen grains, have been carried through the water current, okay? And later on, it reaches to the female flower, that is the stigma of the female flower, and fertilization happens. Yes. Then in another group of water pollination, as you can see, such as in the seagrasses, so what happens? The female, they normally remain submerged in the water itself. So if this is water, basically, so the female flower, it normally being submerged in the water, right? So they are being basically submerged in the water itself. And the male gametes, it is also going to release the male flower that is also going to, that is the anther is also going to release the pollen grains in the water itself. So here what happens is the pollen grains, it has a ribber-like structure. Okay. So pollen grains, basically here, they're long, then they have a ribbon-like structure. So again, these pollen grains, they're being carried through the water current itself, and it reaches to the stigma of the flower and fertilization normally happens. So this is how two examples that has been given in your textbook, and this is how the pollination happens in the Vallisneria as well as the seagrasses. So basically, in both and wind as well as in the water pollination, flowers are not very colorful. Okay, and in general, wind pollination, I'm talking not in the through the biotech, that is insects or animals. I'm talking about the general wind pollination as well as water pollination. So here, what happens is the pollen grains which are being produced, right? They're not very colorful. Okay. And even they do not produce nectar. So that is some of the major things that we need to remember when I'm talking about the wind pollination and water pollination. Reason because there is no necessary, because there are no such agents like insects or animals. Insects basically they get attracted. I'll be saying this in the next slide. Basically, what happens? Insects, they normally get attracted through the nectar as well as inflorescence and all. So as a result, it is going to get its nutrients like nectar and all, right? So instead of that, it is going to transfer the pollen grains from one flower to the another flower. So that is now how happens. But in water pollination as well as in the wind pollination, there is no necessary of the insects because it is happening through the wind as well as water current. So that's why there is no need of nectar and there is no need of colorful inflorescence projection and all because simply it is going to happen. But wherever the process like another biotic agents are that, so for that nectar is very important and inflow showing that colorful fragrance, colorful flower is very important. Right. So majority of flowering plants, they normally use insects and animals as in pollinating agents like butterfly, bees, flies, beetles, and wasps, ants, and still many insects, and even some animals, So hummingbird, right, as well as sunbirds. So these all act as a pollinating agents here. And even sometimes bat, they also acts as a common pollinating agents. So among these, what happens, particularly bees and insects, animals, bees and insects, they act as a dominating way in the pollination. So for example, every large animal such as some of the reptiles, it might be some of the lizards, garden lizards, and rodents, rodents, and even what do you say that some of the animals also, they normally carry the pollen grains, or basically they also carry the pollen grains. Okay, they have also been reported that they also play a very important role in the pollination, knowingly or unknowingly. Often flowers of, animals pollinated plants are specifically adopted for particular species of animal itself. Not every animal will undergo this process. Like they will not play a very important role or major role in the pollination. Rather, only particular species of animals are going to play its major role in the pollination. So, what are the major, insect pollination? Majority of insects pollinations, the pollen grains are majorly they are large, then they are, yes, they are colorful, then fragment. It should also be rich in nectar, right? So because butterfly, bees, and all, they are attracted because of the fragments as well as nectar, then only the pollination will occur. So that then only those insects will go to that flower. If there is no nectar or if there is no fragment, they're not going to go to that plant. So that's why the flower should be large, and it should be colorful. It should consist of fragments as well as it should also be rich in nectar. So these are some of the very important things. And it should also project the inflorescence, okay, so that it can attract the basically what do you say that insects. Animals are also attracted to the flowering plants, right? Flowering, basically, that is colorful flowers and all. So in that way, also some of the beetles and flies, they are attracted towards the nectar, and even some of the animals are also attracted to this nectar. So in that way, also pollination will happen. So the major goal of the pollination is the body of the anther. What happens? So when these animals, they go reaches to the flower. So the reason what happens as a result, what happens? So the body of the animal or insects, right? So they get coated with the pollen grains. So once they get coated with the pollen grains, and now they will shift to the other flower. So what happens? That pollen grains which are being coated or which are been attached to the body of insects or animals, right? So they will be dusted on the stigma of the another flower. So in this way, what happens? Pollination is going to occur. Okay. So another general way how the pollen grain should be, they should be sticky. Basic thing is the pollen grain should be sticky and they should be lightweight and easily carryable by the animals, insects, and all. Okay. So in this way, pollination normally occurs. The wind pollination, then water pollination, and pollination by animals, that is biotic pollination. So there is in the biotic pollination itself, there is again some kind of mutualism can be seen. Like some species, some plants or some flowers of the plants, they normally provide a safer place to lay egg as a reward. So as a reward, what they do is those insects, they are going to help in the pollination. Like, say, if you have taken an example of some species in the moths as well as in the plants, what happens? Plants like yucca. So, where both the species, that is the moth as well as the plant, they cannot complete their life cycle without each other. Like the moth, they normally deposit its egg or their egg in the loci, uh, locule of the ovary. Locule means where ovary, right? So there it is going to deposit its egg, and especially in the flower. So as in turn, what happens? Those from the flower they get pollinated. That is, the moth gets pollinated, and it is going to help in the pollination. Like it moves from one flower to the another flower. In that way, it helps or it plays its major role in the pollination. So after some months, what happens? The larva of the moth comes out of the egg as a seed starts developing. As the seeds start developing, even the moth, that is the larva, moth's larva also starts developing, comes out of the egg. So this is how the pollination occurs, a mutual benefit kind of pollination. So now let us see some of questions regarding this pollination. Which of the following statement is correct? This is from the NCERT exemplar. Clistogamous flowers always exhibit autogamy, right? So in autogamy, we have again two types. One is chasmogamous and clistogamous, right? So you know the differences definition about the chasmogamous as well as the clistogamous, right? So the first statement is actually right. Let us see the another statements also. So chasmogamous flowers always exhibit gynogamous. No. So these flowers, clistogamous flowers exhibit autogamous is right. Gamma is right, but gynogamma is no. In the clistogamma, what happens? The flower itself is enclosed. So whatever the anther and stigma, they have been enclosed within the flower. So flower won't open during the maturity. So what happened as a result? Here, there is no chance of cross pollination. So option one is right. Next. Yeah. So in flowers, which has a single ovule in the ovary and are packed into inflorescence, are usually pollinated by. So do you remember in the pollination is fine, but do you remember in the abiotic pollinations what I have discussed? Water as well as wind. So this kind of pollination can be seen in single ovule in the ovary. This kind of pollination can be seen in whether water, bee, wind, or bat. Option three. So the next question is on assertion as well as reason question. In order to compensate the uncertainties and associated loss of pollen grains during pollination by abiotic agents, the flowers produce enormous amount of pollens when compared to the number of ovules available for pollination. It's true. So reason is pollen grains coming in contact with stigma is a chance factor in both wind and water pollination. So even this statement is also true. What happens is in abiotic conditions, what happens? So there might be a loss of pollen grains because it's either to the wind pollination or air pollination. So yeah, there is a loss of pollen grains. That's why in order to overcome that loss or to make a chances of fertilization very more, so they start producing more pollen grains, right? So this is one thing. Reason is so that they could come in contact with the stigma. Okay, in both the wind as well as water pollination. So, according to the option, both assertion and reasons are true, and reason is a correct explanation of assertion. Both assertion and reason are true, but reason is not a correct explanation of assertion. And assertion is true, but reason is false. Here, assertion is false, but reason is true. So, I hope the question is very simple and clear. So, option is yay. Cool. So this was all regarding the pollination, and you can still check out the entire chapter, which I had made already the video lecture on it. So still, if you find any doubt, just comment me in the comment box and I'll reach out to you. Thank you.